Education was important for urbanized landowning families, especially people studied the law. Law was one of the most popular degrees, and little education was in the countryside. They say that Uruguay and Argentina had the most urbanized and most literate people. A lot of people could read in Argentina and Buenos Aires, and Uruguay, right? In the cities, I guess a lot. So most of the people in Argentina and Uruguay were literate. They could read. Over half the population of Brazil was illiterate. They couldn't read. No more than 2 out of 10 people could read, which is kind of sad. And talented people of mixed racial heritage were able to go and infiltrate into the white middle class by their own merits. So liberalism allowed that a little bit for people to move up in the ladder. And here we have some examples like Joaquim Machado de Assis is one of the greatest Brazilian novelists. In 1897, he became president of the Brazilian Academy of Letters, where he presided over poets and scholars who were mostly white, and he was of mixed race. In Mexico, we have Ignacio Manuel Altamirano. In Peru, we have Ricardo Palma. They're both men of color who became deans of national letters, which is a high position of intellect, right? So liberalism is what allowed these people to climb the ladder. Rubén Darío is a mestizo of Nicaragua and was recognized as a literary genius. Internationally, he created this movement, literary movement called modernismo, modernism, and usually most of the literary movements came from Europe to Latin America. But in this case, Rubén Darío was able to take that modernism from Latin America and influence Europe, which went the other direction, right? It always came from Europe to America, but this time it went from America to Europe, so he was a big deal. By the turn of the century, the Mexican middle class had become notably mestizo. The wealthy landowners controlled the electoral system, and there were a lot of managed elections that would take his clients to vote for them. Uh, Authoritarian rule, oligarchies, and dictatorships happen a lot during this period, and that allows the foreigners to come safely to invest in Latin America and exploit, I guess, the poor local people. To material progress, you needed law and order, and the rule by the brightest, richest, and whitest was the safest way. Positivism is a French social doctrine that prescribed authoritarian, kind of um, ruling to achieve order and progress, made European norms a standard. Government revenues from import export made the police forces and the national armies more equipped and better trained. Stable authoritarian governments was the characterization of the neo-colonial period. So remember, neo-colonial means that new colonial by all these foreigners that you will see, like mainly the British and the U.S. And these kind of dictatorships and oligarchies made it safe for foreigners to come and invest because they will keep everybody controlled. The managed election was seen as a normal way of the world. Oligarchies from Greek means ruled by a few, represented a narrow ruling class, so a few powerful people were ruling everything. Dictatorship is centered in one powerful individual, so one person is in charge of everybody. Oligarchies means ruled by a few, more than one. These forms of government benefited a quarter of the population at the expense of everybody else. So 25% of the population benefited, while 75% of the people did not benefit at all from all this system. Oligarchies and dictatorships provided stability, what foreign investors wanted. So in Mexico, we have Porfirio Diaz, and the rule of Porfirio Diaz happens between 1876 to 1911, and it's called Porfiriato, and was a typical neo-colonial dictatorship. He made it seem like he was constitutional in appearances, but his candidates won always, always. He used revenues to strengthen the Mexican state, getting rid of regional caudillos and crushing or buying them off, so he had all the power. And he would jail any journalist that would speak against him. Mexico acquired a national rail system, and during his time, he created a lot of monument line avenues in the capital city. And for the centennial of Hidalgo's 1810 uprising, the Mexico City police had orders to get rid of the indigenous people from downtown so the foreign visitors will not get the wrong impression of Mexico. Isn't that sad? Um, Diaz was part of Mixtec from indigenous South, a war hero who rose against the French, and he famously defeated on Cinco de Mayo, defeated the French. Remember, Cinco de Mayo celebrates the defeat of the French. It was just a public image, but he never defended indigenous rights or indigenous identities, even though he was part Mixtec, which is indigenous. In the countryside, he founded rurales, mounted national police to secure the environment for the investors. So they'll be keeping in control the local people to make it safe for the foreigners. He oversaw a massive sale of public lands to private ownership, right? And he welcomed foreign investment, and foreigners soon owned a quarter of the Mexican land, as well as the silver and oil underneath it. So he's selling national lands into foreign hands, which is, very sad. So that's Mexico, and that period is called like a period of being very French, trying to imitate the French as well. Um, if you talk about Brazil, Brazil was oligarchic, decentralized. The first Brazilian republic was between 1889 and 1930 and was a federation of 20 states with very weak central government. The states had autonomy. There was local autonomy for each land owning oligarchy. So the cattle ranchers, the coffee and sugar planters, the cacao and rubber barons, each state kept its own export revenues. So it benefited them. It wasn't controlled by the central government. The country state governments together determined who will be president. So they decided who will be president and be in the lead as well. There were riots of resistance to liberal progress. One that was notable was led by Antonio the Counselor, where thousands of believers, between 1893 and 1897, preached against materialism, the modern materialism that happened with all this progress. Canudos was the base and was a huge gathering of people. The Brazilian Federation sent military against this holy city of Canudos, and they destroyed them. At least 10,000 of them were killed. Um, for the uprising, I guess, against the government. The Backlands in 1902, published in 1902, is by Euclides da Cunha, and he describes in this book the fiery battle between civilization, modern army Brazilian positivism, and barbarism, the counselor of it and his followers. And it's very interesting because da Cunha had been schooled in scientific racism. But he changes his mind as he watches the people of Canudos resist, and he sees that the Brazilian mixed race is not inferior, after watching them react and being brave with their ideals. The army used dynamite to destroy the holy city, and it became a classic theme in Brazilian literature. The links to the outside world. The women who campaigned for voting rights in the 1910s and 1920s in Latin America were inspired by Europe and the United States. And the modern feminist movements arose in cities where outside influences were the strongest. So many of the leaders had non Spanish and non Portuguese surnames. Bukowski, Schneider, Laperriere, Moreau, all from Argentina. We have a woman named Paulina Luisi of Uruguay, and was the first woman in her country to get a medical degree in 1909, the first doctor. And in 1922, she became an honorary honorary vice president of the Panamanian Conference of Women, held in the US, and advised the leading Brazilian feminist that will come, Berta Lutz. Berta Lutz is a Swiss Brazilian. Her mother was English. She became a biologist, which is a big deal. Scientists at the time, being women, was very rare. She grew up in Sao Paulo and she studied in Europe for 7 years and returned to Brazil in 1918. She published a feminist call to arms, and she also attended the Pan American Conference of Women, where she met with a pioneer US feminist named Carrie Chapman Catt, and she sketched the constitution for an organization for a Brazilian Federation for Feminine Progress. And her organization is given credit to create Brazilian women's right to vote in 1932, before Uruguay and Argentina and other Latin American countries. So 1932, Brazilian women get the right to vote thanks to Berta Lutz.